Good morning to all of you, and thank you very much, Tim. Actually, I feel this morning all of my motherly strands are coming together because I'm the daughter of a Duke graduate and I'm the daughter of a Stanford graduate. So to be in California with Duke is just absolutely the perfect combination. So thank you very, very much for that very kind introduction, Tim, and thank you for the invitation. And Gary and Linda, thank you very much for having me here. But also thank you in particular for your really very visionary actions. The fact that this is already the 11th navigating the American carbon world really speaks in and of itself of the vision of 11 years ago of navigating at that time a non-existent American carbon world. And finally, thanks to a lot of work here in California, there is a carbon world to be navigated in the United States, or at least in the country of California. And that is actually a very, very good news for all of us. What is very interesting is that as California moves into the carbon world and makes news all around the world, as Linda has said, what is very interesting is that the environment, the carbon world environment in which California inserts itself is not as optimistic as California. In fact, those who are in the carbon markets, I would say, are not in their best mood right now. I would say if they are navigating a boat, they feel like they're navigating in a very dark night without instruments in a perfect storm. And so I would like to speak to you today about the relationship between what is going on here and what is going on in the global context, because ultimately California, large as it is as an economy, is not going to be alone. So why do I say that they're feeling like they're in a dark night? Well, we have diminished demand globally. We have diminished confidence. We have depressed prices, or rather, may I say, I don't know who's more depressed, the prices or the participants in the market. They're sort of competing with each other there. And it's not a rosy picture. And it is actually quite incongruous, in fact, that the global carbon markets are in the slump that they are, when the fact is that climate change is becoming every day more of a concern as a global public policy issue because of the extreme weather events that are coming now more frequently and with more intensity. So I don't have to go through the entire world, but please believe me when I say there is no country that is currently unaffected by climate change. And to not go too far, here in the United States, of course, Sandy is perhaps the most vibrant example, but southwestern United States with the droughts that were there, very difficult situation for farmers. And in fact, I'll have you know that the US Department of Agriculture has created what they call a misery index. Now, coming from Costa Rica, which is the happiest country in the world, because there was a poll made about happiness in countries and we came out #1, it's very difficult for me to understand that USDA creates a misery index. But they have created a misery index, and the misery index, this is no joke, this is true, look it up. And the misery index is composed of a combination of temperature and humidity, or rather temperature and the lack of precipitation. And they are predicting that the number of days that the United States agricultural belt is going to be subjective to temperatures over 100 degrees is going to increase substantially over the next few years, causing much death in the animal life and, of course, a loss in crops. So they are worried that the United States is actually moving up in the misery index. And that is just a small example of what we are seeing all around the world. Now, the good news there is that because of the increased awareness of the effects, the negative effects of climate change, we do have increased action on climate. So through this very, very dark night, which I understand that we're in the carbon markets, I would say we have two guiding stars. A little bit like the North Star for those who live in the north, and the South guiding star, the Southern Cross. What do I mean by those two guiding stars? The first guiding star that we have is the fact that climate change is being progressively addressed at all different levels. And let me quickly go through three different levels for you. At the international level, yes, the Climate Change Convention negotiations are very slow, but they are moving in the right direction, and they are progressively addressing the challenge of the global framework that needs to provide certainty for all countries on what policies are going to be put in place. We have now a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol that has already gone into effect in January of this year for those countries that are participating in the Kyoto Protocol. We have an agreement that governments have made that they are going to come to a global universal framework agreement by the year 2015, and they are moving along the timeline that they have set themselves in order to come to that agreement. We have all industrialized countries, all of them, without exception, with concrete mitigation pledges on the table. We have 56 developing countries that, having no historical responsibility in climate change, have nevertheless made their pledges on what they are going to do on mitigation. And we have at the national level, very interestingly, already much more action than we had seen 3 or 4 years ago. We have 30 countries around the world that have comprehensive climate change legislation, one shining example being Mexico, but not the only one. We have 100 countries around the world that have renewable energy legislation, and many more that have regulations to incentivize energy efficiency. And at the private level, we have increasing investment into renewable energy. We've already surpassed $1 trillion of investment into renewable energies. We have around the world 100 gigawatts of solar already installed. We have 200 gigawatts of wind already installed. And would you believe it, in the United States, your contiguous country right here on the borders of California, in the United States, there is so much wind and solar installed, much more than actually the coal and gas that is installed in the United States. A pretty astounding fact. So we are moving in the right direction. Problem is not fast enough and not at the scale that is needed to keep the world under the 2-degree maximum temperature rise that governments have actually committed themselves to. But we are progressively moving at the international, at the national, domestic, and at the private sector level toward addressing climate change in both legislation, in regulation, and on the investment side. So that is one of our guiding stars. The other guiding star, call it the Southern Cross if you want, is the fact that carbon markets are actually popping up all over the place, not only in California. Yes, it is actually very good news that California will be linking with Quebec, and I know there are conversations to link with RGGI over on the East Coast and perhaps also Australia. That is very good news. But California is not alone. We have, just in this continent, we have Mexico moving forward with their own carbon market scheme. We have Brazil looking into how they are going to do it. We have in Chile already an ETS system that covers the power sector. And in the all-powerful and huge economy of Costa Rica, we have a burgeoning domestic carbon market that hopes not only to take Costa Rica to a certain level of emission reductions, but actually to carbon neutrality. That in the continent of the Americas. Down under, we have South Africa, and we have Australia already with their systems of either a carbon tax or a carbon price. In Asia, we have Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan, all with their particular interpretations of what kind of a carbon pricing system is going to work for their economies. And of course, China. We have China with 5 cities and 2 provinces moving into each of their own particular carbon market schemes, and then figuring out, as we speak, how are they going to actually develop a national carbon market for China. So carbon markets are on the up and up, and that is a very important guiding star when we look at how are we going to address climate. Now, if you are trying to navigate a boat in a dark night, you need not only the guiding stars, it would probably also be very helpful if you had some instruments. So do we have some instruments? Yes, we do. And let me just name 4 instruments that we have for the navigation. Number 1, we have the CDM, which deserves the credit of having pioneered this whole concept of the carbon market. It is, of course, much easier for all of these carbon markets that I have just named to now figure out what they want to do, because they can profit from both the pains and the growth of the CDM market. The CDM was the first one out, the first kid out there experimenting, definitely made a lot of mistakes, but is now ready for prime time. The CDM now has 6,000 registered projects. They now have some top-down methodologies that are being developed. They have POAs, which are programs of activities, which allow for the scale-up and allow for an unlimited number of mitigation activities to actually be bundled together and be taken forward in mitigation efforts, in fact, even across country boundaries. And perhaps most importantly for the growth of markets, now the CDM has standardized baselines that allows for a much more objective assessment of quantification of the mitigation attained by each of the activities. So the CDM is actually a very important instrument that can be used by all of these global markets, by all of these individual markets that are now being built around the world. Then we have the NMM, which is not a competition to San Francisco's Ghirardelli chocolate factory. It is actually the new market mechanism, which is being discussed also at the global level and is being conceived as being different, related to and complementary to the CDM, but different because it starts out not as a project-by-project effort like the CDM started out, but rather a much more, a broader scope, let's say a sectoral scope, sectoral approach to mitigation, because it is now clear that mitigation needs to go to scale, and governments are looking at market mechanisms that are international, like the NMM, that would, somebody has got to give us a new name for that, don't you think? If you think of something, please send me an email. That is actually going to allow for these much broader mitigation efforts in developing countries. And then we have, of course, the collection of domestic or bilateral markets or ETSs, but in any event, some pricing system that is coming up in all of the countries that I have just mentioned. And we have, as a 4th instrument, we have the framework of various approaches, which is the code word. I'm sorry for the very strange name, but is the code word the governments are using to figure out how are they going to interlink all of these different market systems that are mushrooming up around the world, because it's very evident that there does need to be some sort of standardization, there does need to be some sort of quality control that assures market participants and above all assures the atmosphere, because it's about affecting the atmosphere, that a ton reduced in Japan is the equivalent of a ton reduced in California, is the equivalent of a ton reduced in Chile. So we do have to have a quality control and standardization. We equally have to have a quantity control that assures that the ton that is counted in Japan is not double counted in California or in Chile. So both for quantity and for quality, there does need to be a global system that interlinks all of these different markets and assures the environmental integrity of the collectivity of all of these different systems. So those, my friends, are 4 instruments at least that are being used by governments and by the private sector that is helping to develop these instruments to help us to navigate the very difficult waters of addressing climate change. Now, there are many people who say, well, you know, they're very worried about the growth of all of these markets because we are used to having one market. We're used to having the CDM as the one and only market. And now that we have all of these other markets on the growth, well, there are many people that are very worried and they're saying, you know, we're going to end up with a fragmented market with everybody doing their own thing. Well, it may seem like that, but I don't think that's where we're going to end up. That's where we're starting, and I would say it's a good thing that we're starting there, because the market needs to make sense for the participants that are going to be the first participants in that market. So the market for Japan needs to make sense for Japan. The market for California needs to make sense for California. The market for Chile needs to make sense for Chile. But ultimately, it is my fundamental belief that all of these individual markets are going to be no more fragmented than the different instruments in the captain's bridge. Yes, the captain needs very many different instruments, but they're all there for a purpose, and he needs to have access to all of these to figure out what the route is. And that is how those individual markets have to eventually be interlinked. Because if they're not interlinked, it defies and contradicts the very purpose of creating a market, which is to reduce the cost of emissions, to get to emission reductions, take them to scale, attain as many emission reductions as possible at the lowest possible cost with as much certainty and predictability as possible. And if each market remains an island unto itself, we are not achieving that global goal. So these markets will eventually be interlinked. They will allow each other to scale up, and they will be interlinked in a way that they will be fungible with each other, and that they will be capable of growing with the global growing economy. That is the purpose of that instrument, of the market instrument, and that is the path that we are moving toward. So, my good friends, as you navigate the American carbon market, and I'm sure there is still a lot of navigation to do in that chapter, but as you navigate the American carbon market, please remember that all oceans on this planet are interlinked. And it is in everybody's best interest to ensure that everybody who navigates these oceans can actually have smooth sailing. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time, so we have some microphones. We're happy to take questions. Thank you, Executive Secretary Christiana Figueres, for both that inspiring speech and for the willingness to take some questions. Anybody? Come on up.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bilal Anwar. I'm with Perry Johnson Registrar. Thank you very much, Christiana, for very insightful and interesting speech. As always, very positive. You painted a very optimistic picture. And just to mention that we in the private sector, we indeed are worried. And we are super worried, actually, what is going on in the carbon market. It has direct impact, obviously, it has impact on the international policy making, but also it has impact directly on the business as well. Now, my question is, I mean, you rightly mentioned that trillions of dollars of investment has been gone into the renewable technologies, which have reduced the cost of reduction of GHG emissions tremendously as well. At the same time, you mentioned about the carbon markets, which are popping up every corner of the world. And that same is a kind of indication that the carbon markets have shown to the world how to reduce and cost efficiently reduce. Now, the question is, why the international policy making, why the response from the international governments is not really matching up with the business sector? Now, the biggest argument which I've been hearing from a number of years is the cost on the economies. And that's what the government have been using not to moving forward, at least not to moving forward in a full force. But what we're seeing in the private sector, there's a lot of activity and there's a lot of enthusiasm and a kind of indication that it can be done and can be done in a cost-efficient manner, but the international policy is not matching up. From your experience, how do you see the kind of linking up of these two approaches within the government sector and the private sector? Thank you.
Thank you. I wish we had a private sector, but we don't have a private sector. Let us be very honest. We have at least two private sectors, those in this room and your colleagues around the world. And then we have the other private sector that is very interested in keeping the status quo. And that other private sector is, with all due respect to all of you, is much better organized, certainly much better funded, and is much louder. And my question actually is, why does this private sector in this room, the one on this side of the battle, why is this private sector not raising its voice to governments in as effective and a compelling way as the other private sector? Because let us be very clear, what we have here is a battle of technologies. We have a battle of the old technologies that we know are becoming every day more and more stranded assets. And we have the new technologies that are coming on board. I don't have to mention the fact that solar price has come down 65% in the last few years. They are definitely the up-and-coming technologies. It doesn't mean that hydrocarbons are going to disappear, right? It means that we have to move toward a healthier mix of hydrocarbons and renewable energy. But that is not the way the other private sector is interpreting it. The other private sector is interpreting this as a battle for their life. So we have to engage in a much more constructive conversation to understand that, yes, there is going to be a role for hydrocarbons. This is not about the death of hydrocarbons. This is about how are we going to complement and how is the growth in demand of energy going to come from renewable energy while there will still be a big, if I can use the word base load here a different interpretation, there will be a base load of hydrocarbon in the global energy mix, but it has to be complemented with renewable energies. So those companies in the oil and gas industry need to understand that they have a future here, that they can continue to be energy providers if they also invest, and they are. And we just had a very interesting COP in Doha, right in the middle of the Gulf, and it is fascinating what the Gulf is doing. The Gulf, of course, we all think of the Gulf as being the major producer and exporter of oil, but they are investing into renewables. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, 41 gigawatts of solar being invested by Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates just inaugurated the largest concentrated solar power plant in the world. They are investing because they understand this is the future. So that's the path that we have to continue. So it's not that governments aren't listening to the private sector, it's that there are two voices, and the voices need to be brought together for governments to be able to confidently move forward. Because there's no government that is going to take a decision that is being interpreted by governments as actually working in contradiction to the interests of their own industry. So governments need to hear, yes, we are ready to move, yes, we can do this. So we need to have these two voices come together.
Christiana, good morning. Terry Tamminen with the R20. Good to see you, and thank you for being here. We work, as you know, with subnational governments all over the world, and California, here in the United States, having been one of the leading subnational governments on setting climate policy and cap-and-trade policy and so forth. I apologize, I missed the beginning of your remarks if you already covered this. Got in here a little bit late, but I'm wondering if you could offer advice to California and the other Californias around the world, the other subnational governments. You've seen what these subnational governments have done on policies, but what else would you want them to do to help support what the UNFCCC is trying to accomplish at the national and international level? Are there things which states, especially the size of California, could be doing that they are not?
Well, I am old enough to know that you never give advice to anybody. That was taught to me by my daughters. But let me start by actually recognizing the fact that subnationals, California, but many others, either state governments or city governments or municipal governments, have taken an extraordinary leadership in climate policy. And we all know that 70% of greenhouse gas emissions currently come from cities, 70%. So if there is any geographic space in which greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced, it's precisely in the urban areas. So the fact that we have these subnationals actually taking a leadership role is very comforting. I also believe that there is a need for the climate convention, which is a convention among federal governments. There is a need for the recognition of everything that is being done at the subnational level. And that has been very evident for many years. And I believe that we are now on a very hopeful path of being able to recognize all of these activities. What is critical at these subnational level is how do you attain a vertical integration between what is happening all the way down at the community level to the municipal level, to the city government, to the provincial or state level, to the national level. How do you integrate all of those policies and incentive systems to be able to optimize the action on the ground? Because it is only through that optimization that you're actually going to get most of the benefits. And national governments have the added challenge of seeing how they then align the international decisions that they're taking with all of those other levels. So that, to me, is the cutting edge of where subnationals need to think now, because subnationals, from what I can see, are looking very much at whatever level they are working, but are they also looking up and down their value chain, so to speak, up and down the financial chain? Are they looking both down into their communities as well as up into the national and then the international level? That, to me, is the challenge there. And conversely, the challenge of national governments is to give the due recognition at the international level to what subnationals are already doing and what more they can do.
Thank you. This is on. So, good morning. Thank you for your remarks. I'm Louis Bloomberg with the Nature Conservancy. For many years, the European Union has been one of those bright stars that we've all looked for leadership. And only yesterday there was a vote, apparently, to defeat efforts to tighten the cap. And I wondered if, borrowing on your metaphor, how you interpret this, and if you think it might be the tsunami that will sink the ship.
No, backloading is not going to be a tsunami. So we've known that the EU had to vote on backloading, and we've known it for quite a while. It is disappointing how they voted, but drawing on my analogy of navigation in the seas, I think what we have to understand is that this is a long-term effort. Yes, the backloading decision is a blow to the market. Is it the death blow? Absolutely not. It is because we cannot look at the waves. We have waves that go up and down, okay? We have good news, we have bad news in the market. But it's not the waves that determine the direction. It's the current. And the current is toward addressing climate change and toward looking at markets as one instrument. I hope I didn't give you the impression the markets is the only instrument. It is a very powerful instrument, but it is one instrument. There also are many policies that are being enacted by governments that are complementary to the market that also will help with climate change. So yes, disappointed by the backloading decision. Is it a death blow? No. We have, we're all grown-ups. We know that there are blows and there are good news in the market. The fact is climate has to be addressed. The fact is markets are growing. And even the European Union sometimes makes a mistake.